Okay, here we are, week 15, and in this week we kind of hit two different approaches in about the same era. So, as always, Jones is coming at it from a social angle, not a business history type angle. And when we're looking at that, nostalgia is the king for the majority of this time period from Jones' perspective. It goes from, hey, like, and the study and the understanding of, first of all, nostalgia being that we, when we are in a time of turmoil, want to go back to a time in our own life history where things were simpler, where we were happier. A lot of times when we're young or children and like we don't have an understanding of everything that's actually happening, I think is a lot of what drives it. You know, I still look at like the idea of nostalgia for me, like I have a lot of that coming from video games and books and shows from when I was a kid in the 90s and late 80s, but also I harken back to like the Andy Griffith Show because my dad and I would watch it together. So reading about that and seeing what triggered it really made a lot of sense to me, because when I go back and I still watch things like Adam 12 or the Andy Griffith Show or these other nostalgic shows that were really my dad's nostalgic shows, it fed into it because it was a time in my own life that came before my understanding of the turmoil that was around me, like the late 90s with the Oklahoma City bombing or Columbine. And so to understand the people through the 60s and the Vietnam era, all the way up through the 90s and things that I experienced in my own life, of course we wanted to go back to times that felt simpler and happier, even though when we look at the actual history of the things happening in like the 50s, it wasn't simpler and it wasn't easier and it wasn't nicer. They were going through the Red Scare at that time. The idea of being suburban and fitting into a mold and this cookie cutterness, which was this feeling of safety in the conformity, it was artificially created even then. It was a false front, so to speak. So I thought that was really interesting that you have all this revival and reviews from these older times that people were going to. But I also think, and again, I'm going to link back to our studies in development of modern theater, the money that was going into this there was so much money and they weren't making the money back on Broadway at this time, and they weren't taking risks on new writers and new directors. A lot of Broadway was trying to hold on to what was already there, but it was dying and the area was seedy still, and the revivals themselves weren't doing enough. Even though people were going, it wasn't enough. And then the corporations moved in, and we have Disney move in, and they hit it out of the park with Beauty and the Beast and really fully jumpstart that revival of the area, not of the shows, but of the area. So these revivals failing and gentrification being stopped led to Disney going, you know what, we can get this spot really cheap and let's see how much more money we can make. Let's see how much commercialism can work for us. And it did. To the point of their gentrification, their historical-ish rebuilding of the theater, which I blanked on the name of, but had the Follies, if I remember correctly from my reading, and I left my books in the other room. It led to where everyone, I'm jumping back and forth really between the readings, but the abandoned gentrification and then the success of it, it went from a place that no one was going very often unless you were specifically there just to see a show, to a place where middle-class families could go as a tourist destination to Broadway. And it revamped Times Square, and it lit the fire under their butts to make it really happen and be a place that people want to go to again and visit. That also gave way for we had, just before Beauty and the Beast and Disney coming in, we had the British invasion coming across from England, mostly Tim Rice, Andrew Lloyd Webber, and Cameron Mackintosh. Those are the big ones. They're the ones who did it. Starting with Cats, which is a fantastic show, I feel like it's very sort of avant-garde and experimental theater. It is not realistic in any sort of the way. It is so out there. And we're personifying cats. Like, that is so in expressionism and surrealism. Like, it's hitting all of these things. But it hit. And the way that the songs were done, it hit, and it called to music that people were wanting to listen to now, or then, but in the now when it was happening. And so we see all of this, and it's just this, it opened a door, and it created an experimental theater that worked on Broadway that came from somewhere else. And it was less money to start out in London, and then Mackintosh was quoted in Stempel's book talking about you could be even more successful if you went international, but when you went from London to Broadway, if you could be successful on Broadway, that was a litmus test for how successful you could be internationally. And what I thought was really interesting is Stempel called this chapter distancing, but I really think it was more of an opposite. Like, as in space, yes, we're distancing ourselves and getting further and further separated, but really it was making the world smaller. It was making international blockbusters of stage theater possible. Miss Saigon, Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera. These are worldwide sensations, and that happened because of all the mix of the right pieces at the right time, and because these shows were able to jump across the pond from England to America and find instant success. They were able to transcend and just keep going beyond and find success in other cultures and places, because Cameron Mackintosh was great at making it a corporate product so that everything was the same and the quality control was there. And just, it was really interesting. It was a really interesting piece, and I could keep going, but I'm also losing my thoughts, and so that was just, I thought it was really neat to see how the revival and the nostalgia and the British invasion all revitalized Broadway. And yes, it left what it originally was, and I think I talked about the xenophobia, which molded it, couldn't happen anymore. Yeah, I think it was more of a shift away from the American-centric xenophobic ideas, which molded the first really big shift from like the minstrelsy and stuff of Broadway and vaudevillian into a more international existence. And so again, I don't think it was distancing. I think it was making the world smaller.